Giant sent us their previous version of the Stance, and quite frankly, we're quite surprised that they wanted us to ever review another one, because it's safe to say the review wasn't exactly overwhelmingly positive. Now, however, the Stance has been updated for 2024 and has a rear through axle. It'll set you back just under 2,900 Canadian. It isn't available in the US yet, but we hope to see it there in the near future.
Compared to the previous generation of the Stance, there have been some serious geometry changes, which is great to see a refresh. It's longer, it's slacker, and now there's a rear through axle. So great to see all those changes.
So you'll notice that this bike has a lot of Giant's house branded components. The saddle, the grips, the cockpit, the wheels, even the fork come from them. And one of the reasons that they're able to do this is they own their own factories. So it makes it a little bit easier to produce the components they want and put them at a bike at this price point.
Yeah, and it's interesting because the dropper post is actually the same one that they use across all of their bikes, regardless of price. And so they kind of try to reduce those SKUs, but then they do have this bike in a 29 or a 27.5-inch version. We have the 29-inch version here. And the target audience for this bike is basically just somebody getting into riding and kind of wants to up their game, is what Giant says.
This bike has 125 millimeters of rear travel and 140 millimeter fork. And that rear travel comes courtesy of what Giant is calling their Flexpoint suspension system. Basically, link-driven single pivot with flex stays, similar layout to what we're seeing become very popular on cross-country bikes these days.
In-house is no bad thing, especially when trying to deliver at a price point. That said, it does offer something different to how most other brands do things, which can make comparisons, on paper at least, a little bit harder. But we did ride the bike and not the spec sheet. So how does this thing climb?
The Stance has 125 millimeters of rear travel, and on the climbs, it doesn't feel like it sits too deep into that travel, and so it really feels pretty lively and efficient on the climbs.
Yeah, and that rear shock doesn't have any adjustments other than rebounds. There's no lockout or any type of climb switch you can use, so it's a good thing that this is an efficient pedaler. We should also mention that it's a bike that rides lighter than it is. We try not to focus on weight too much in these field tests, but this bike does feel like pretty kind of good trail bike weight. It doesn't feel overly lethargic or sluggish.
It's not, I wouldn't call it a snappy climber, but it's not a bike that, it's no slouch either. And it has good traction when you're kind of trying to get up over things. I mean, we were comparing it to some Hardtail, so definitely a lot more traction than those bikes. And yeah, it just kind of makes it up things and keeps you on line. And yeah, the rear suspension works pretty well for climbing, and the climbing position also is pretty comfortable. It's got that pretty steep seat tube angle.
Yeah, it's fairly neutral, and I think that this bike is designed for the rider that may be their first real mountain bike or someone that's wanting to progress their skills, and I think that the geometry works well for that. A little bit longer chain stays compared to some bikes, and the reach is long without being overly long, so I think it kind of hits a nice middle ground for someone that just wants to ride and experiment and try different types of trails.
The Stance offers decent traction in a simple package. The bikes also show that while weight is a factor, where the bike holds that weight can have a larger effect on climbing performance. But let's get to the part where you and Giant's product team will be really interested in. How does this thing descend, and has it taken a giant leap forward for the bike brand?
Onto the Sense, that fork up front, that crest fork, it's gonna be the first thing dealing with the impacts. The good news is it does a pretty good job. A little bit of a top out if you're really kind of bunny hopping or pulling hard, there is some top out. Overall, it's well controlled and does a good job of managing its 140 millimeters of travel.
The one thing that's crazy about that fork is how many rebound clicks there are. You have lots of adjustment for your rebound.
Yeah, you can really fine tune it. It's like 35 clicks or something like that, so you can really get the exact feel you want. Yeah, and then overall, I mean, we reviewed the previous model and we weren't super impressed with its downhill performance, and this one, it's just a great step forward. It's the head tube angle, I think it's 2 degrees slacker than before. It's got that through axle in the rear end, so you don't have to worry about any kind of quick release related issues. Just feels like a much more competent, solid descender.
Yeah, it feels a lot more stable when you're descending. You don't have to kind of, think about, can the bike and the suspension handle this? You can kind of just, look at the trail and just go. And
the geometry numbers there are a little bit more moderate than the rest of Giant's lineup. I think the reach might be 10 millimeters shorter than some of the other ones. And again, the head tube angle is not super slack. It's also not super steep. So it is in that middle ground kind of design for somebody that's really testing the waters. You could use this if you wanted to. You could use this in a cross-country race maybe, or just kind of more for general trail riding. So I think that's, it's kind of a really great entry-level product.
Yeah, it's not a super smashy bike. It has 125 millimeters of travel, like we said, and it rides really well on light technical trails, more flowy trails, and on those trails that it's suited to, it's really fun. It does a great job on that kind of terrain.
A ground-up beginner bike then. and a bike that's trying to offer something different to its more expensive siblings other than price alone. Speaking of which, let's have a rundown of what they've hung off that frame.
When talking about components, we have to talk about brakes, and these ones actually work really well. They're 4-piston brakes, and they slow down, they stop, they're not terrifying, they don't make any loud noises, so there's nothing to complain about with those brakes. The one thing that was a little bit difficult when I was setting up the bike is it's just a little bit difficult with the slide-on grips, with the ergonomics of the SX shifter, just to kind of get everything clean and like comfortable for how you want to ride it when you're out on the trails.
Yeah, it's one of those gripes we've had before where you get the shifter has to go in one spot and then the brake lever goes in another, and they kind of don't always play nice. So depending on how long your thumbs are, actually reaching the shifter can become difficult. Something that happens on these value price bikes. Some are getting better though. We have some other ones that we'll be talking about. They've actually got it pretty dialed, but something to keep in mind. Just might make it a little trickier, a little more time consuming to really get things to feel the way you'd like. One issue that some riders might run into has to do with a dropper post. You're limited on the insertion due to the way that the seat tube is tipped. So luckily you can adjust how much travel, like how much drop the dropper post actually has, but there's only so far you can lower it into the frame just due to that design. So we're always pushing for those longer travel dropper posts. On this bike, depending on your frame size, you might not be able to run quite as long as a dropper post as you would like.
One thing that it was nice to see was those Maxxis tires. There's a dissector and a minion on this bike, and yeah, just super confident feeling tires, really solid, and yeah, makes you definitely feel like you can trust the bike a little bit more when you have that kind of rubber on it.
We did run into some little issues with the rear shock. It tends to lose a lot of air pressure when you take the shock pump off, so that can make setup a little bit tricky. And further exacerbating that is the fact that there's no O-ring on the shock, which is the way you would set your sag. So you can use a zip tie in a pinch and then just remove it once it's all set up. But it's all those little things, like an O-ring would cost a couple cents, and it'd be nice if they added that O-ring on there just to make setup easier.
Yeah, and just to make it a little bit more kind of consistent, because you might, the bike might feel great one time you go out, but then it's really hard to kind of get the same air pressure again without the O-ring and with the air that kind of comes out whenever you take off the pump.
And the final note about components is it does have those slide-on grips. It's again a little bit of a cost-cutting measure, but I would like to see lock-ons just for safety. Realistically, I don't want anyone's grip sliding off, especially in wet conditions. Sometimes push-on grips do have a tendency to twist and move around, so lock-ons would have been really good to see on this bike.
When it comes to getting locked in, Kaz knows a thing or two. You should see his spreadsheets. So, Excel wizards and Davis Clark to one side. Who's this bike for?
So this bike kind of designed for the entry-level rider, and I was just thinking, if this was my first bike, how excited I'd be. Or first real mountain bike, I should say. I mean, imagine starting with this bike.
Yeah, it's definitely not the bike that I started riding with, and I think it has a lot more confidence than kind of those first bikes that I had. And if you were a beginner rider, you'd be really lucky to get out on this bike. It's definitely like the perfect bike for you. Giant did a great job of creating a bike for that beginner rider and somebody who kind of wants to progress as they ride on this bike.
Yeah, and the price point, it's not designed really as a kid's bike, but for a high school or someone like that, it's still, again, it's not a cheap bike, but for the price and for what you get for it, I think it's gonna be a really good starting point for a lot of riders.
Okay, well, if only we could turn back time to have this bike as our very first mountain bike. That seems like a good circumstance. What are the bike's pros and cons?
It's really great to see all those upgrades from the previous model. The geometry is way better. There's a rear through axle, and all of those house branded components actually work pretty well and really help keep that price point down, which Giant is really lucky to be able to do.
As far as cons go, I think really just some of those basic ergonomics, just getting it set up so you can have the dropper and the shifter and everything in the right position can take some time. And then also that dropper post insertion, that's gonna be a limiting factor for some riders. But again, given this bike's intentions, it's not really the end of the world, but definitely something that people that like longer travel dropper posts should keep in mind.
The Giant Stance is a great bike for somebody that's just looking at getting into riding, although maybe it's not for the sender who is looking for a budget bike. It's really aimed at the beginner rider, and that's no bad thing. And the mild, easygoing manners of the Stance might feel slightly more intuitive to a learner than the raked out, long, low slack angles of a modern enduro bike. Thank you for watching the Value Bike Field Test. Be sure to subscribe to Pinkbike so you never miss our latest mountain biking videos.